Happy Friday, we're finally here. It's been a busy week in Queensland, of course, with the budget being handed down, so the pollies are still busy squabbling in state parliament as we speak. My name's Brendan Smith, I'm the state political reporter for Network 10, and I'm thrilled to be your MC for this afternoon. We're of course here to speak with Mr. Adam Bandt MP. He is the member for Melbourne and leader of the Australian Greens. He is a former industrial lawyer representing union workers. Mr. Bandt was elected in 2010 as the first Green elected to the House of Reps at a general election. Mr. Bandt is the Green spokesperson for climate change and energy and workplace relations. He has also served as deputy leader under Richard Di Natale and Christine Milne during the Gillard power-sharing government. The subsequent agreement between the Greens and Labor resulted in the creation of the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, as well as carbon price being legislated. This was the only time carbon pollution has decreased in Australia. As leader of the Greens, Adam Bandt has pushed for the Greens platform to focus on climate change and economic inequality, elevating the party to its best election result in 2022, or as some would call it, a green slide here in the Sunshine State. Mr. Bandt has committed to using the Greens' representation in Parliament to push the Albanese Labor government to stop opening new coal and gas mines while supporting workers, reducing economic inequality and taking action on the housing crisis. Can we all please join me in welcoming Mr. Bandt to the stage?
Thank you. It is a real delight to be here, and also to know, to find out that this is the first time a Greens leader has come here, and I want to thank you very much for extending that invitation. I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I also want to offer my congratulations to the people of Brisbane on your new MPs. You've elected three incredible people to the lower house, one of whom, Elizabeth Watson-Brown, is here with us today, as well as a powerful new Greens senator from Gladstone, Penny Allman-Payne. I am really excited about this expanded Greens team that is going to be coming to Canberra. I've had the privilege of working very closely with these newly elected people for some time. And I think one of the things that I've learned, and as you look across the country at both the state and at the federal level as well, is that when people get Greens MPs, they tend to like it. And they find out that those Greens MPs will work diligently and hard to represent community interests, and that just as hard as we'll fight for action on climate change, we'll fight for people locally as well. And I think that here in Queensland it'll be no exception. And I also want to acknowledge my colleague who wasn't up for re-election this time, but who has just been re-elected by the party room as our leader in the Senate, Senator Larissa Waters, who is not only an amazing representative for the people of Queensland, but who now has the pleasant problem of having gone from being the only Queensland senator and representative in the party room to now being 5 Queensland MPs in the party room. I also want to thank the Queensland Media Club for having me here today, and also acknowledge the work and thanks and the extending of the invitation from the sponsors. And I can't but note that, of course, in an election where the issue of aircraft noise played a role, I do want to thank Brisbane Airport Corporation, A, for giving me a seamless entry into Brisbane today, but also B, for acknowledging that this is something that we are going to push during this term of Parliament, but giving us the platform to have this. We really appreciate it, and thank you for extending the invitation to have discussions about what is an important issue for the community over coming years. The Greens have had their best result ever in Queensland, and Queensland is now poised in many respects to become the most progressive state in the country. We're in this position because we ran a strong election campaign based on 2 central planks. No new coal and gas, 1, and billionaires and big corporations need to pay their fair share of tax so that we can all have a better life, 2. We offered an economic alternative and a climate alternative. In an election where Labor spent most of their time agreeing with the Liberals, these two policy planks, plus the incredible people-powered campaign in these lower house seats, were the keys to our success. And now, as we hold balance of power in the Senate and have more Greens in the lower house than ever before, as part of the biggest crossbench that this country has ever seen, we have a mandate and the power to push the government to go further and faster on the climate and inequality crises. In the next Parliament, the Greens will be fighting for everyone's future. Our demands are simple. No new coal and gas, no tax cuts for the billionaires and the very rich. Instead, big corporations need to pay their fair share of tax, and we need to use that money to fund the essentials, like health, housing and education, properly. As the next Parliament is about to begin, today I'd like to outline how we will push the government to tackle the cost of living and inequality crisis. But before I do, I want to make a few remarks about the other big crisis that we face, the climate crisis. The climate crisis is caused by the mining and burning of coal and gas. We cannot end the climate wars and still keep approving more coal and gas. Right now, there are 114 new coal and gas projects in the pipeline. If just a select few of these go ahead, it will blow our carbon budget and lead to more homes and businesses becoming uninsurable. If we hit 2 degrees of warming, the Great Barrier Reef will die. And the 60,000 Queensland jobs that rely on it will also go. More coal and gas mines will cause more floods, fires and droughts. They will increase the cost of living, as has been the case with the rising food prices that we're currently facing. They will damage infrastructure, destroying homes, roads and bridges, as we can see here in Brisbane and down in the Northern Rivers in recent times. Labor's plan is based on 2 degrees or more of global heating. It is inconsistent with the Paris Agreement. It locks in the death of the reef. At this point, the government has offered very little in the way of compromise on targets, instead suggesting that the Parliament just take it or leave it. Now, the Greens are open to working constructively with this new government, but they've got to drop this my way or the highway approach. The public has just rejected that kind of hairy-chested politics. At this election, Labor's vote went backwards, and the public sent pro-climate MPs to Canberra in numbers never before seen. There is so much support for real climate action in this Parliament that the only obstacle to greater climate action is Labor. The only way to keep people safe, manage the economy and reduce the cost of living is to take action on the climate crisis. We cannot afford to keep approving new coal and gas projects. It is not only the most expensive form of power, it's deadly. It's not only costing the earth, it's blowing the budget. We cannot afford to keep subsidising this dangerous industry. This financial year alone, the public, you, are handing $11.3 billion in public money to the coal, oil and gas industries. What's more, the gas industry, according to the Australian Taxation Office, is a systemic non-payer of tax. That's their words. 96% of the gas industry is overseas owned, so billions of dollars of profits from resources that this country owns are going offshore effectively tax-free. Now, the Greens respect coal and gas workers, and it was a central element of our campaign. We recognise the role that they have played in building this country. But we have to tell the truth, which is that this industry does not have a safe future. And that's why the Greens' policy is to support workers and communities, including by growing new industries like green mining and metals. We made clear, as Penny and I travelled around parts of regional Queensland, from our point of view, the best job for a coal worker in many places is another mining job. we are well placed to be mining and processing the minerals and metals that the world will need in a zero carbon economy, and Queensland is poised to seize those advantages as well. What we need is a plan to ensure it happens. However, at the heart of Australia's problem with the climate crisis is largely the same problem which lies at the heart of our cost of living and inequality crisis. The reason it has been so hard to tackle the climate crisis in Australia is because coal and gas corporations have enormous power and they are taking this country for a ride. The current energy crisis gripping much of the East Coast is caused by coal and gas corporations. The rules of the energy market were written to suit these big corporations, to the point where some say they're reluctant to generate power because they can't make enough money, even as prices soar. As the Prime Minister said, they have been gaming the system, but it's a system that is built to be gamed. Meanwhile, in a country already awash with gas, costs to households and businesses are sky high and show no sign of coming down for years, according to the ACCC. The same systemic non-payers of tax that the ATO was talking about are the ones now holding us to ransom. In 1 year, 27 big gas corporations brought in $77 billion of revenue but paid no tax. And across the board in this country, 1 in 3 big corporations in this country pays no tax. When a nurse pays more tax than a multinational, something is seriously wrong. And of course, the big gas corporations continue to force businesses and households to pay high prices while making massive windfall profits off the back of a despicable invasion being carried out by a dictator overseas. At the same time, though, wealth inequality in Australia is the worst it has been. The profits share of the economy is higher than ever before, while the share going to wages is the lowest in history. There are over 3 million Australians living in poverty. Nearly 500,000 women over the age of 45 are at risk of becoming homeless. Too many young people cannot leave home because it's too tough to find an affordable place to live. Government income support forces people to live below the poverty line. Wages have flatlined before the pandemic, and now working people are going backwards. Unemployment is at record lows, but that hasn't flowed into a better life for working people. Working people have more insecure work, fewer rights, and wage theft is endemic across numerous industries. This is where the government needs to rethink its first budget, due in a matter of months. And this is where we will push them. Labor is proposing to make inequality worse by locking in tax cuts for billionaires like Clive Palmer in its first budget. Labor is getting ready to lock in stage 3 tax cuts, which destroy our progressive taxation system. They'll make inequality in this country worse and turbocharge inflation. It will mean that working people in low-paid jobs are still under pressure, while billionaires like Clive Palmer get a $9,000 tax cut per year every year forever. In balance of power in the Senate, we will push Labor to ditch these unfair tax cuts that will rip $244 billion out of the public purse. Labor must rethink these tax cuts for billionaires and save our progressive taxation system before it's too late. If these tax cuts for the very wealthy proceed, we will move a step closer to US-style inequality, where the government fails to provide the basic essential services that people need to survive. Labor shouldn't give Clive Palmer a tax cut while people can't afford to get their teeth fixed. The Greens would rather get dental into Medicare than give Clive Palmer a $9,000 a year tax cut. 2/3 of these tax cuts will go to men, and just 1/3 will go to women. They are unfair. The wealthiest 1% will pocket as much from these tax cuts as the poorest 50% of income earners combined. These tax cuts haven't come into effect yet. We can reverse them without asking everyday people to pay a single dollar more in tax than they're paying now. But for the amount that we save, we could get dental into Medicare, build 1 million affordable homes, wipe student debt, and build the clean energy infrastructure we need to get off coal and gas. By stopping the tax cuts for billionaires, and also by ending the handouts to coal and gas corporations, and by making the big corporations and billionaires pay their fair share of tax, the public purse would be $433 billion better off over the decade. You can do a lot to make society fairer with that money. This is where the government should find savings. But we are worried that the government won't have the guts to do what's necessary. We've already seen that they think they can end the climate wars but still hand billions of dollars in public handouts to the enemy, the very coal and gas corporations causing the crisis. Labor has a choice. Either we make the big corporations and billionaires pay their fair share, or we continue this slide into debt and austerity. The Greens will not support a Labor budget that is based on cuts that hurt everyday people while continuing the handouts to billionaires. We will seek to amend the first budget if Labor proceeds with the tax cuts for billionaires and handouts to coal and gas corporations. We will not stand quietly by while Australia is sold off and sold out. Labor is going to come under pressure from their big donors. We've already seen the fear campaigns that are being fired up around the decision to increase the minimum wage. But we know that the government can count. With the Greens, the government has the numbers in the Senate to pass the laws which would truly transform the inequality and cost of living crises that we have in front of us. The danger that we face is that the new government seeks to continue the Liberal slide into austerity. With the Greens in the Senate, Labor has the numbers to fix the budget by making big corporations and billionaires pay their fair share of tax. We have the numbers to end the fossil fuel subsidies, and we can kill the outrageous stage 3 tax cuts. You cannot fix the budget if you're handing Clive Palmer a tax cut of over $9,000 a year. People are struggling to keep a roof over their heads, and the last thing that that guy needs is a tax cut or more money. A graphic designer, sure, a spell checker, probably, but not more money. He does not need it. He certainly should not be the public putting its hand in their pocket to give Clive Palmer more money. But that is what the government is proposing. Today, I also want to announce that the Greens will be pushing Labor to back a new gas windfall levy to deal with the current crisis that we're in. Australia already has a windfall tax. It's called the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax. The only problem is it's completely broken. Gas corporations have figured out how to game it so that they will never pay tax. Gas corporations have built up a pile of $282 billion in tax credits between them. That means they have to work through $282 billion of profits, the equivalent of the GDP of Finland, before they would have to pay any tax at all. All we have to do is make a simple change to the law, preventing the use of these tax credits, and we can scoop up some of the windfall gains that these big gas corporations are making off us right now. The money raised just from closing this loophole and fixing the tax more broadly would raise $59 billion over the estimates, which we can use to help homes and businesses weather the crisis and get off gas. We have the numbers in the Parliament if Labor wants to do what it says it does. Let's build 1 million affordable homes. Let's make childcare free. Let's tackle the climate emergency. We can do this without asking everyday people to pay more, but we have to face facts. We're in a crisis, and it's caused by giving big corporations billions in public handouts, by refusing to make them pay their fair share of tax, and by letting them write the rules we all have to play by. And as an aside, and maybe we can explore this a bit later in the Q&A, this is what is driving the inflation crisis that we're facing at the moment. The cost of getting gas out of the ground hasn't gone up, but the cost of gas is going up because of international events. The cost of education has just doubled for many people for higher education as a result of decisions of the last government. It is this push towards greater profits using our own resources that is in large part behind this inflationary push that we're seeing at the moment. And it's not workers who should have to accept lower wages to fund it. It's these big corporations who should be asked to pay their fair share of tax to help fund some of the things that would bring down the cost of living. That is how we can start to tackle inflation. We stand ready. The Greens stand ready to campaign and fight for a better future. One where everyone has an affordable home, a secure job, in a truly fair society, one which embraces the fair go, not just as a slogan, but as a foundational value for organising the distribution of wealth and the resources that we all require. The Liberals have trashed the place. Energy policy is in a mess, as the Liberals have sold us out to coal and gas corporations. The cost of living is through the roof and inequality is at record highs. But crisis presents an opportunity to fix it and to make people's lives better. Let's start by fixing political donations, by establishing an integrity commission with real power, implementing all of the recommendations of the Banking Royal Commission, and getting rid of all the dodgy mates rates policies established by the last government. We have a parliament elected by the people, not the ASX, so let's start passing laws which put the people first. The coming term of parliament has incredible potential. We're excited. More people voted for us than ever before because our people-powered campaign vowed to kick the Liberals out and push Labor further and faster on the climate crisis and tackling inequality. Now, we want to be constructive. Everyone is pretty sick of the petty point scoring and aggressive, divisive politics. But we're not a rubber stamp. This is the critical decade for climate action, and inequality is spiralling out of control. Even though they're in a majority government in the lower house, it would be a mistake for this new government to take the growing crossbench for granted. The best outcomes will come from us all working together and putting the people first. Thank you.
If we'd like to head over to the table, if you can please introduce yourself, where you're from, and we'll go from there.
Hello. Yes. Hi, Joe Hinchliffe from The Guardian. Mr. Bandt, the Queensland really delivered for the Greens at the last election, and it feels like there is a moment in history here for some meaningful change, progressive change. Do you acknowledge criticism that in getting embroiled in internal debates, as we've seen in Victoria over trans rights, and also external debates around issues like the Australian flag, do you acknowledge that there is a risk that I guess you could alienate some of the new voters who've come to the Greens, or even perhaps risk missing this moment, this critical moment in history? As you've said, this decade is critical for climate action. Is there a risk in missing that opportunity?
I don't think so, and as I've just laid out, we've got some pretty clear priorities, and I'm really looking for, a lot of our new senators haven't even taken up office yet. They'll take up on the 1st of July, and they are going to bring a lot, and they're going to be involved in the discussions about how we want to use these next few years. We've been really clear about the challenges that are facing us and the approach that we want to take to this current parliament. And I guess what I've just laid out to you are the priorities for us that we will be pushing for. We think we've got a real opportunity, probably the best opportunity for a long time, to get climate action and also to tackle inequality. Like, we're up for it. And I know the new government is just finding its feet. I think the first tests are going to be when we start seeing the budget and whether they think we can cut our way back, or whether they're prepared to look at some of those areas that we've said. Our priorities are crystal clear, and we're not going to be sidetracked. We will focus on delivering for people, because that's why people came over to us. And one of the messages that we will be very clear on delivering during this parliament is that just as hard as we will fight for climate action, and people know that we will fight for that, we are going to fight to make everyday people's lives better. And we've outlined a way of doing it that doesn't involve asking everyday people to pay more. In fact, it's going to involve making people's lives better. That's what we're going to focus on.
Any other questions from the media table? Jamie?
Mr. Bandt, Jamie Walker from the Australian newspaper. If I could just ask you to elaborate on your comments about and just to make sure we understand it correctly, are you saying that the Greens in the Senate will block the Labor budget proposed for October if it includes provision for stage 3 tax cuts? And if that's the case, how do you justify that when Labor will argue that it has an election mandate to proceed with this tax relief?
No, we're not talking about blocking, but as you know, there's various pieces of legislation that comprise a budget, and those pieces of legislation can be amended. And that is something that we reserve the right to pursue in the Senate. And the government, to get its agenda through, needs to have pieces of legislation that pass through the Senate. And we intend to use the power that people have vested in us after this election to push the next government to stop giving billions of dollars to big corporations, big coal and gas corporations, especially when they're not paying any tax, and also to stop giving the tax cuts to Clive Palmer. The government, as you would well know, there will likely be a number of pieces of legislation that come up to implement various government measures. Over this period, we're laying down some very clear markers about the kind of change that we expect to see and that people have put us there to push for. And we're putting that out clearly in advance so that the government knows the change that we are expecting to see. And a message that we want to send is very clear. The government is going to find it very hard to persuade us that we should be cutting public spending at the same time as they want to give billions of dollars to help fund tax cuts to people like Clive Palmer. Right? This is a key question that the Treasurer and the new government are going to have to confront. And we will be there. We are saying very, very clearly, if you want our support to get your measures through the Senate, then we are offering ways of fixing the budget that don't involve touching everyday people or cutting government programs or requiring people to still continue living in poverty. You'll find it very hard to persuade us that you've got to keep people living below the poverty line if they don't have a job, while at the same time finding extra money in the budget to give Clive Palmer a tax cut.
If I can just follow up, forgive me for asking you this, but are my notes correct? You said during your remarks that you will not support a Labor budget if it includes the stage 3 tax relief. What are you saying in terms of what you will do? And can I be specific and ask you, what is your message here to the government? What is the difference saying we will not support a Labor budget and we will block supply? Because it seems to me that is precisely what you're saying. That is precisely the message that you are sending to the new government, that you will not support a budget that includes any of these tax relief measures.
I think I just answered that in quite some detail. It was very clear we're not talking about blocking supply, but as you would know, budgets require several pieces of legislation to get passed. We have the right to move to amend those or to even not support some of them, but we've been very clear that that's not about blocking supply.
How do you differentiate between that, though, if you say you will not support the budget?
Well, been very clear that I don't know how to say more other than to repeat my answer and to say we wait and see when the legislation comes to the Parliament.
Any other questions?
I've got a couple more. Mr. Bandt, what do you make of the Queensland government's raising of royalties on coal? Did it go far enough? And what do you think about calls that are coming from central Queensland communities that those profits should be reinvested in coal communities to help a transition to a renewable economy?
Well, in a general, I defer to my Queensland colleagues about my Queensland state colleagues about the decisions of the Queensland state government. In general terms, it's always a good idea to ask coal and gas corporations to contribute to paying their fair share, but it's got to be part of a plan that says we're transitioning away from coal in a way that supports communities, right? And if budgets continue to rely on increased coal and gas capacity, then those budgets are putting communities at risk. Right? We can't keep building budgets off the back of growing the coal and gas industry when we know that those sectors are incompatible with life as we know it. Like, they are a threat. Like, that is a threat to us staying below the climate thresholds. So yes, the money that is raised from these big coal and gas corporations should be reinvested back into the community. But what we also know, and this is one very clear message that I got as I was visiting coal and gas corporations in regional Queensland, regional New South Wales, is that people know change is coming, right? And in the Hunter Valley, the message to me was very clear. One coal worker said, it's the worst kept secret around this place. Everyone knows coal has got a use-by date. We're just waiting for politicians to come and talk to us and be honest about it and to talk about a plan, but they don't. Politicians keep coming in and saying we can keep opening up new coal mines and exporting it out past the 2050 and still meet our climate targets, when we can't. And I would suggest that workers right around the country, including in New South Wales and Queensland, know that politicians are lying to them when they say we can keep expanding the coal and gas industry and still meet our climate targets. So what we need is some honesty in the discussion, right? We need some honesty in the discussion that says coal and gas corporations are now, coal and gas, we know, are fueling the climate crisis. We didn't know that 50 years ago, but we know it now. And we are all in this together. We've all got to make this transition together. The burden cannot fall unfairly on coal and gas workers and communities, right? They didn't cause the climate crisis. Coal and gas workers are not the enemy. What we need is a national plan. That's the area that I'm responsible for. We need a national plan that says, let's go in now and have a planned phase out of these industries and make them pay their fair share of tax and use that money to grow the sustainable industries that will be there for those workers and communities when the rest of the world tells us to stop digging. And it is that kind of reinvestment and that kind of plan that we need. And the point that we're making during the election is that in many of those places, these new jobs will look a lot like existing jobs. It'll be mining, it'll be processing, it'll be maintenance work, it'll be contracting work. It'll just be associated with perhaps vanadium or lithium rather than coal or gas. And we also have a massive, massive job, and here's where we could see some potential to work with the government because our plan is akin to theirs. We need effectively a Snowy Hydro 3.0, a massive build of renewables in this country to tackle the climate crisis and drive energy costs down in the time that we have available to us before the window to tackle the climate change closes. Now, that's going to involve massive investment, including here in Queensland, massive investment in new plants and transmission lines in particular, and investment in new forms of storage. All of that is jobs rich. All of that is jobs rich. That's where those money should be going, rather than continuing to build budgets on the perpetual continuation of the coal and gas sectors when we know that they can't continue the way they have been.
I think when we look at this state of play right now, obviously social housing, cost of living is such a major issue. In Queensland alone, there's more than 50,000 people on the social housing register. The government likes to rebrand that in its own speak as 30,000 families, but in real terms, it's more than 50,000. What needs to happen right now to ensure that families, that young people do get a good start in life, do get that Australian fair go, rather than constantly being on this waiting list?
The government needs to build more affordable homes. Our plan is for the government to build 1 million affordable homes over the next 20 years to tackle the housing crisis that we've got, and they would be homes, combination of units and freestanding dwellings, but homes that people could rent for 25% of their income or buy into for about $300,000 as part of a shared equity scheme, so that you get a stable house, that could be you get your first foot on the rung of the property ladder, or it could be a place that you choose to stay in for life. But one of the things that we've lost in this country is the idea that housing is a human right and that government therefore has some responsibility for meeting it. If we turned 30,000 people away from public schools every year, there'd be an outcry. But the fact that 30,000 people can't find a public home seems to be seen as a problem with the private market rather than something the government should step in and do. So we are arguing for a big build over the next couple of decades of public and affordable homes, because I think first home buyers in particular, but also other people who are locked out of the housing market or at risk of homelessness, older women are the fastest growing group of homeless people, need a new way in. If there's not a new way in to this ever-rising housing market, people will be locked out potentially for life. And when you look around, my area of Melbourne has got one of the highest concentrations of public housing of any electorate in Victoria in the country. And you see those big tower blocks that if you come in, from the on Tullamarine, if you visit Melbourne, come into the airport, you'll see those, as you get to those big yellow and red sticks across, you'll see those big towers. They were all built in the 1960s, right? Population has gone up since then, but government hasn't had a new build of public housing since then. And as a result, there is enormous, enormous pressure on the market. So what are we going to do to ensure that young people and people locked out have a start and that people at risk have a start? Government needs to build more public housing. We had that costed for the government to invest in that project of building 1 million public homes over the next 2 decades. Over the next 10-year period, which is as far as the PBO looks out, Parliamentary Budget Office, about $23 billion over that period. That is a third of what the public currently spends in giving tax breaks to investors who've got 2 or more homes, right? So we're already spending this money. It's just going in a way that's pushing up prices and locking people out. For a third of that, you could build and everyone could have a roof over their head.
Now, I know we touched on the green slide here in Queensland before. Do you think that's a shift in voter values and ideals, or do you think it was simply because Australians wanted to get rid of Scott Morrison?
I think there's a number of things happening. I think we made it really clear during the election that we wanted to see that government gone because the things that matter to us and that matter to the country, the government was a barrier to getting action on climate, on tackling inequality. But what they wanted was an alternative. And the approach from the now government during the election, which some media commentators called a small target approach, was essentially to agree with the government on all the key issues, including things like giving out tax cuts to Clive Palmer. On all of those big issues, they went and agreed. The feedback that was coming from the door-knocking groups in Queensland was that people heard that message from Labor, that they were exactly the same as the government, and said, well, why should we vote for you then? And we put forward something different. And I think there's perhaps a bit of a myth in the rest of the country or amongst some of the political class that Queenslanders are inherently conservative, and we always knew that was wrong. The view that we took was that people in inner city Brisbane, but right across Queensland, perhaps had a better understanding that politics was broken and not working for everyday people and was just delivering for vested interests, perhaps a better understanding than many others across the country. And so we said, we are here to change that. We are unbeholden to the interests that are the vested interests that are holding politics back. We are going to push to make politics work for you. We agree with you that it is broken at the moment and it's not working for everyday people. And that is why I think we saw such a big shift in the vote in Queensland. So I guess it's a bit of both, but it's also a bit more complex in that one of the things that I think it sends a very clear message to Parliament is that people want politics to start working for them again, and that's part of our job.
Now we saw at the 2020 state election, obviously Jackie Tradd's saga didn't help her at all, and that was claimed by the Greens. Do you think this green slide will have ramifications at the next state election? Do you think it's time for... I mean, obviously you think it's time for change being the Greens leader, but do you think that shift will transition into a state level as well, or what's your prediction?
Well, I guess one thing that's worth noting is that in many respects it already has, and one of the things that we knew and that perhaps the rest of the country hadn't paid a lot of attention to is, of course, this has been part of a a deliberate process of re-engagement with people by Greens in Queensland to make politics work for them. That, of course, has started with the first result we saw was with Jonathan Sri getting elected to the Brisbane City Council, and I think the rest of the country probably didn't necessarily appreciate that quite what a significant achievement that is, like how important it is to win a council seat here. And then, of course, one state MP getting elected, and then another state MP, and then we've seen now 3 federal MPs getting elected in many areas that overlap with those. So this isn't a flash in the pan. This is something that Greens in Queensland have been melding those planks of climate action, an economic alternative and a people-powered campaign for some time. And again, to go to my point that I said before, is that I think when people have seen a Greens in action, say, on Brisbane City Council, they realise they're going to get someone who puts them first and who works for them, because we're not beholden to the factions, we're not beholden to the donors, we put people first. And that spirit is, I think, is going to continue to grow. And I think the state election is going to be very exciting for the Greens. And I think there's every chance that you're going to see a similar growth in support for us that you've seen at the federal election. But I think there's also one other lesson from this federal election that I know in my neighbouring seat, the Treasurer Joss Frydenberg learnt very well, which is that no one can take anything for granted anymore, and it's an error if you do it. And what the community is increasingly saying, we want people who are going to work for us, and they will pay very close attention to what people do while they're in Parliament and reward them if they think they've done well, or but send them on their way if they haven't.
Any other questions from the table?
Yes, if I could ask just one more question. Jamie Walker again from The Australian. Your party talked a big game during the federal election and was rewarded, particularly here in Brisbane. So if I can take you to one issue that has resonance in this town, aircraft noise, which you referred to in your remarks. Your candidates proposed a 10 p.m. curfew at Brisbane Airport and a cap on flight movements, quite specific measures. How do you deliver that from the crossbenches? And if you can't, aren't voters entitled to mark you down at the next election?
I think we have seen in previous parliaments a lot of things delivered from the crossbenches, because the crossbenches and third voices bring ideas and plans to the table that the others won't touch. I think what my experience in Melbourne, where we've also had issues with aircraft noise, is that, and I think it's a growing issue for people who live in inner cities, because our regulations were designed in an era of lower traffic and of less noise, and increasingly this is going to become a problem not only in Brisbane but in other cities as well, and one that we're going to have to tackle, is that people want to know that you're in there fighting for them. Right? People want to know that you're going to fight for them and that you will put their needs first. And people haven't had that. They've had members of Parliament who have taken them for granted and who have put others' needs ahead of the community's needs. And when people see that you are there shoulder to shoulder with them, fighting to tackle things like aircraft noise, they respect that. And part of our job in this Parliament is to say to the government, you can fix this. You can fix this. And I think the government should look at the results and understand that people are prepared to change their vote, including on issues like this. And so there is an opportunity now for this problem to be fixed, and we will push the government to fix it. The government has the capacity to fix it. If it requires legislation, then we're prepared to work with them to get that legislation through the Senate. But part of our job is to now be good local members and represent the community, take their fight to Canberra and push the government to fix it. And in 3 years' time, the community will look and see whether we've done the best we can to fight to push the government to fix it, and we'll judge the government accordingly. If the government hasn't fixed it, then that will be on the government's head.
The last one from me. Adam, Mr. Bandt, does Brisbane now provide a model for electoral success for the Greens for the rest of the country? And as you noted earlier, and as we're all aware now, this wasn't a flash in the pan, the last election. It was years of disciplined campaigning and strategic planning. So the question is, have you identified where the next Brisbane is going to be, and have you started doing the work that led to the success here at the last election?
Look, our priority at the moment is to... we'll have our review of the election. We haven't had that yet. There will be a review. There always is after every election. No surprises there. We'll have that review. And at some point between now and the next election, we'll identify our priority seats. We're not at that point. We're not at that point yet. Our priority is to now work out, having identified that the key areas that we want to see action from this government on are around climate and inequality. Our job is to now push for that in Parliament, as well as representing the local communities. Yes, it's a template. It's something that the rest of the country and the rest of the Greens are learning from and are looking at very, very closely, because it has because our strength as Greens is being a grassroots party, and is our members and is our supporters. And what we've just shown is that can overcome multi-million-dollar advertising budgets from our opponents, and it can result in people getting the representatives that will fight for them in Parliament. And it is something that the rest of the country is looking at very closely, and it's those three key planks that I mentioned of having the climate alternative, having an economic alternative, and having a people-powered campaign that was put together so well here in Queensland, and I think is an exemplar for us across the country. And there will be some state elections coming up in other places around the country. There'll be a federal election. But yes, it's something that everyone is rightly paying a lot of attention to, and I'm encouraging people to pay attention to as well.
We know this week the choice to remove the Australian flag from behind the press conference caused some issues. Peter Dutton has labelled it as virtue signalling. Others are saying it's creating more of a divide between white Australians and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Do you think that as a nation we're moving forward or backwards when it comes to acknowledging our First Nations people?
It's I'm really excited that there are so many First Nations people in this Parliament, and we have got 2 out of our 16 now. A strong First Nations women, Lydia Thorpe and Dorinda Cox, and I think there is potential for progress in this Parliament and taking some real steps towards First Nations justice, and that is something that we are up for and want to work with the government and work across the Parliament, if the will is there from the other side, to advance. And that's not only seeing progress on elements that we were pushing during the election campaign, for example, around truth and treaty, but also some really significant reforms around incarceration, raising the age of criminal responsibility so that we're not locking up 10-year-old children in Australia, starting to close the gap. There are some real differences that we could make and that we want to make during the course of this Parliament. To answer your question though, one of the things that I don't think Parliament has done a very good job at is telling the truth about the history of this country. There's a lot for us to be proud of, but there are also elements that caused a lot of pain and continue to cause a lot of pain for a lot of people in this country. And for many First Nations people, or for First Nations people generally, that history of the founding of Australia was a history of violence and dispossession. And we've got to start doing a better job of talking about that and telling the truth in this country, because it's only by having an open and honest discussion about that we're going to then be able to move forward and heal. And in Victoria, there's a process, there's a truth and treaty process that has commenced that is starting to tackle that. And that's the kind of thing we would like to see nationally, because we think that is key to progress, is starting by having an honest discussion. Because the problem is that if you fail to have that discussion and be open about it, then you risk perpetuating the injustices and revisiting them on people. We've had, it was a very, very key moment when we had the apology to the stolen generations from Kevin Rudd before, and a lot of work went into that. We've still got a few more reckonings to do in this country with our history. I do think, in some respects, to answer your question, there is progress being made, and we're up for fast-tracking that progress. But what we really want to see in this country, in the same way that it started in Victoria, is the beginning of that process of all of us in Parliament starting to tell the truth about that violence and dispossession, because it's only by doing that that we'll be able to move forward together. And the upside of doing that is that we will be a much stronger and more united country if we do that. And this is one of the things that we're really excited about, like the opportunity to have discussions around not only an honest discussion around the history, but also to then have discussions around things like a treaty with or treaties with our First Nations owners, provides us with a massive opportunity to then say, right, we've talked about it and we've begun the healing process, and now we're going to all move forward together. And it's that I think we're still a few steps away from. And part of our job in Parliament is to push for that, because I think starting to tell the truth and then having the healing process and the agreement process will benefit all of us. If we can do that, it will absolutely benefit all of us.
Now, we know the transgender swimming ban was talked about this week. Many are calling it regressive. Others are saying it will level the playing field. Do you think this will open up the floodgates to further discrimination of LGBTQI plus youth and further add to the mental health epidemic that we're seeing in Australia?
I was very distressed during the federal election when the then government, who was behind in the polls and didn't really have much to offer, decided to try and start a culture war by attacking people who need our support. Amongst the trans community, research suggests that about half of them, by the age of 24, have attempted suicide or self-harm. That is an appalling statistic, right? And that should be a signal to all of us that here is a community that needs support as we, not only as a society, debate issues relevant to the community, but just recognises them as human beings and supports them for who they are. Though the mental health of our trans community is already at close to crisis point, and what they need is political leaders and a political discussion that starts from the basis that they are supported, right? That they are recognised, that they are supported 100%, and that their rights are non-negotiable. And what concerns me is that we will continue to have figures, including in politics, who will attempt to prosecute culture wars off the back of a group of people that need our support. And that's the approach that we're going to take. That's the approach that we're going to continue to take, which is trans rights are non-negotiable. There should be an absolute backing and support of not only their rights, but a consideration of how we as parliamentarians can support and improve the well-being of this group as part of what should be our general push of supporting everyone's well-being. So I am concerned that the way debate goes might impact on mental health. Our commitment is that we're not going to participate in that kind of debate if others want to have it. Our focus is on ensuring that every trans person in our community knows that they are loved, supported and respected. I've seen during the course of the marriage equality debates what happens to a community when their right to exist is thought to be up for grabs, and it is not good. And we have an obligation, whatever people may think about decisions that others are making and so on, we have an obligation as a community and as a parliament to conduct ourselves in a way that is not going to put people's mental health or their well-being at risk.
Any other questions from the table? Well, I'll give my final question. We finally have a new government in. The election campaign is over. We don't have to ever hear "there's a hole in my bucket" one more time. I think if I heard that again, I'd smash my TV. But anyway, what is your prediction for the Albanese government? Will it be a one-term government? If you had a crystal ball, what will happen?
I think it's too early to say, but I do think that I think the opposition is already going down the wrong track. If they think embracing climate denial is the key to their electoral return, then I think they're going to be in opposition for a very long time. And I think that is not the message to take from this election. I think, as I say, this parliament has the opportunity to make some significant reforms on issues that matter to people. Like, we really do. Like, it's the most exciting opportunity there's been for a long time. And I guess my only prediction would be that I think there is every chance the next election you're going to see even more third voices in Parliament. I think this is not something that is a one-off. Like, there is a growing desire from people to be represented by people who are going to put their interests first. You saw, and you know, there was a lot of talk about, oh, well, there are other independents who are getting a lot of media attention. Does that concern you as the Greens? It's like, well, no. What we just saw at this election, Liberals' vote went backwards, Labor's vote went backwards, the Greens went up, and independents went up, right? And I think that trend may well continue. And so don't be surprised if at the next election you see more Greens and independents in Parliament.
Well, that is it. You're off the hook. Can we please thank Mr. Adam Bandt? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that does conclude our luncheon for today. I'd once again like to thank our naming rights partners, Brisbane Airport Corporation, Dial Before You Dig and Griffith Uni, as well as our other event partners. Have a wonderful Friday. I hear there might be an after party at the rugby luncheon. Watch out. I said it was peak Queensland before a rugby lunch and cracking tinnies at 11 o'clock. So there you go. Enjoy your afternoon and thank you so much.